it's not going to be easy either for China or for Russia to simply, divide Europe and the United States. And the business relationship between Europe and China, as the column mentions, is close to $800 billion a year. That is total more than the total Indian exports to the world. So you can see the scale of interdependence between Europe and China.
In this week's Rajamandala, you take on a very interesting question, which is Russia and China and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. They recently had that summit level meeting in Moscow, all bonhomie. Whether they clearly aim to sow divisions in the West, this new Western unity, which is the first time perhaps since the Cold War, post the Ukrainian invasion that we've seen. Do commercial interests and strategic interests and the interplay between them? Because say France and Spain going there, they will make the right noises surely about democracy and freedom and withdrawal, but they have commercial interests with China as with Russia in a way that say the US does not. Or how does that play out, that tension which everyone thought would, in fact a lot of people thought that the commercial interests would overcome or energy needs would overcome geopolitical concerns by now?
No, my sense is the hopes of US, Russia and China, that there are differences within the US that can be exploited, as well as differences between US and Europe that can be exploited. What we've argued in the column is on both the fronts, it looks doubtful they can actually do it. Let's start with the US domestic politics. There, I think Russia's hope has been a section of the Republican Party, is the Fox News, and a lot of people are saying, look, why are we supporting Ukraine, endlessly, that it is better to, bring this war to a close. Both Mr. Trump and the Florida governor, DeSantis, they've actually publicly criticized President Biden's Ukraine policy. But then it's important to remember that while Trump today talks about being, different policy on Russia, it was his administration that actually laid out the framework that Russia is a threat. In fact, the national security strategy issued by Trump in 2017 said both Russia and China are threats. So that's the first time since the end of the Cold War that the US administration has said that. So I think what you say in campaign is not what you say in power. And DeSantis had to actually pull back very quickly, because once the media piles on, as in India, in a much more vicious form, that it is not easy to break ranks when you have a war, you have such a major, challenge for US presence in Europe and Asia. So I think DeSantis had to pull back. So I think it's important for Indians to remember that we read so much of the stuff that's coming out of the US. It's like a Tower of Babel. It's like hundreds of people, Professor so-and-so said, actually, it's all America's fault. It's a large country. There's a massive IR in international relations discourse. But I think we should be clear that there is a strategic core in the United States. There is a deep state that once it takes decisions, they have the consistency and the capacity to pursue them. So my sense is on Russia and on China, and we'll come back to China, that the decision has been taken that if you don't fight Russia in Ukraine, then you'll have even a bigger challenge, because if Putin gets away with it in Ukraine, he might try it out with other European countries. So my sense is Russia's objective of exploiting internal divisions in the US on the question of Ukraine don't look too bright. Now, talking about China, China's play is less political and more economic, because there is actually a political consensus in the US. Look, China has a problem, we have to deal with it. But China hopes that the business community, by drawing the business community, by encouraging American business, guys come back, make some money, there's loads of money to be made in China. Because historically, for 40 years, the US business has been an ally of China. The biggest campaigners for China in Washington have been the US businesses. But today, when the geopolitical conflict has become sharp between US and China, it's unlikely that the Wall Street or Apple's Tim Cook, the companies like that, which are deeply tied to China, can actually change political policy. So I think we must remember like good, classical analysis of Marxism. I mean, while capital operates freely, it is not about the state. In the end, capitalism is still organized within nation states. And if the nation state decides there is an existential challenge, there's no way of a business to overrule the political class. Like in India too. I mean, you'll have large number of companies. Look, let's continue to do business with China. But India has a problem on the boundary. It's not going to do business as usual. So I think same in the US. There is a political consensus that China has a problem, and that economic and technological pressure must be mounted on China. And I think it will be very difficult for Wall Street or for industry to break ranks.
Now as a follow-up, but also to take you to your column last week, where last week's column, this week's column, everyone should read it. It is on the indianexpress.com. And this week's you will find in the description of the video wherever you're watching. The Eastern European countries coming together. Other groupings which are in fact more overtly strategic or military almost now forming within Europe. And then you have, say, France and Germany, who initially were seen as reluctant critics of Mr. Putin, and now, of course, after the invasion, they were. Europe, if we say for a second, try to look at it as an entity rather than separate nation states. Is these kinds of fissures, is it something that whether through commercial incentives or just strategic fatigue, if the war goes on, say, for another 4 years, if this is sort of, or 2 years, or is there some kind of thing that within Europe, Russia or China may find some, if not allies is a very strong word, but some respite?
Yeah, I think Russia was betting on the hope, both Russia and China, hope that they can divide Europe from the United States. But the fact is, the scale of the challenge presented by Russia and Ukraine has actually helped Europe close ranks.
Yeah.
Europeans have suddenly discovered that they can't defend themselves, and nobody expected Russia to do what it has done. And if today it's Ukraine, tomorrow it can be Poland. So in some senses, given the security dependence of Europe on the United States and the scale of challenge presented by Russia, I don't see that ranks breaking in the near term. But there are clearly differences on how long can we do this war? What are the terms of peace? For example, Poland and France don't agree on. For example, Spain, which is far away from the border of Russia, might say, look, let's go on as business as usual. But I think for Central Europeans, it doesn't work. So while there are differences, disputes within the Western alliance, it's important to remember that the broad strategic unity between Europe and US has been maintained for 75, nearly 80 years since the Second World War. And they've seen multiple crises. We remember in Iraq, for example, Germany and France were absolutely opposed to the intervention. And Russia actually joined them. But today, I think when they're directly faced with security threat, while they will argue internally about what is the best way of achieving peace, but I don't think they can afford to break ranks. So I think we should expect them to continue. For example, it was hoped that Russia's dependence on Russia for energy would make it hard for Europe to sustain an anti-Russia policy. But I think one winter has gone. Yeah. They've survived, and they seem to be reasonably okay to do another winter. And the next 6 months, we don't know what will happen. Yeah. So I think the hopes of for Russia, at least, those have not worked. This week, as the column points out, there's a big engagement between China and the European leaders. Yeah. China certainly invested a lot of effort over the last 20 years in cultivating relationship with Europe. Yeah. And the business relationship between Europe and China, as the column mentions, is close to $800 billion a year. That is more than the total Indian exports. Yeah. To the world. So you can see the scale of interdependence between Europe and China. Here is what they're trying to do is this. China thinks that given the trade relationship, Europe will not follow the Americans on isolating China on economy and technology. They would not decouple. That is the main demand of the Chinese. But for the Europeans are saying, look, we want the Chinese to help us with Russia, getting Russia to walk out of Ukraine, to support peace. So that is what the two demands are. Yeah. So It's not clear if Xi Jinping can deliver Putin on Ukraine, but they'll keep talking on that. Second, on the business side, the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, she's in China right now. They've all reached today, and she gave a speech in Brussels 2 days ago, where she said, "Look, we don't want to decouple because we have really big economic stake, but we want to de-risk the relationship." So she's trying to separate the idea of de-risking from complete decoupling. And de-risking will involve actually cutting down dependence on China for materials, limiting export of sensitive technologies to China, to become more self-sufficient in critical sectors. So I think that's not good news for China.
Yeah.
So for China, actually, while Europe has serious disputes with the US on the economic issues, it is actually what von der Leyen said is actually Europe is willing to work with the United States in putting pressure on China while protecting its general trade relationship. China might, of course, still hope that what EU says is not what EU will do, and that individual countries might still prefer to do business. And so they would hope Macron will be different, because Macron talks about strategic autonomy. Macron talks about, France and Europe must have an independent policy other than the US. But I think it will be very hard for France to simply come and say, look, okay, we will buy what China says on Ukraine. No, they want China. Macron will want Xi Jinping to do more on Ukraine. So he'll want to do business with China, more business. But at the same time, I'm sure he'll also talk about Western values, democracy, human rights, as well as the need for a more, shall we say, less assertive Chinese foreign policy. So next 2-3 days, we'll see how this visit plays out. But my sense is it's not going to be easy either for China or for Russia to simply, divide Europe and the United States. If you go back to history, I mean, there was a time when China and Russia were both communist. Yeah. China still pretends to be a communist country. There was a time the communists used to talk about inter-imperialist contradictions. That the contradictions between one center of imperialism, one center of capitalism, another center are real, and those contradictions can be exploited by the progressive or communist forces. But what we saw in the 50s, 60s, 70s was actually it was the inter-socialist contradiction that came to the fore. That it was China and Russia that fell out, despite being communist countries. And Nixon and Kissinger exploited the differences between China and Russia. So China and Russia have come back together. But I think US has actually rallied together much of the West. It has mobilized the third largest economy, Japan. It has mobilized the fourth largest economy, Germany, to stand up to China and Russia, respectively. So I think Americans, despite the talk about the decline, I think they have a lot of cards to play. And I think it will be unwise for anyone to underestimate their power. But I think China and Russia probably overestimating their own strength and underestimating the strength of the United States. But then the show has just begun. My sense is this play will go on, but it's certainly for India, it will be worth watching.
Thank you so much, sir. We will see you next week. Everyone, read the column. It is on theindianexpress.com. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Akash.